rejected son, returns as CEO, and his first decision destroys his own family. The clock read 8:15 a.m. when the main entrance of Andrade & Sons headquarters opened, revealing a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit and a cold, steady gaze. Employees, used to seeing only the older Andrade family members walking through those marble corridors, froze in place. Whispers rippled instantly through the reception area like silent waves. It was Henrique Andrade, the son who had been rejected and cast out of the family more than 20 years ago. For most people there, he was just a story passed around in hushed tones during lunch breaks. The son who shamed the family. The one who disappeared and never came back. Few knew exactly why he had been pushed away, but everyone knew the official version told by Patriarch Lucio Andrade. Henrique wasn't fit to lead the company and had stained the family's name with disgraceful choices. The truth was far uglier. Henrique was only 18 when, after his mother's sudden death, he learned he would inherit a small share of the company's stock. Lucio, afraid of losing control to a son he deemed immature, manipulated the will with the help of lawyers and pressured Henrique into selling his shares for a fraction of their value. When Henrique refused, the false accusations began, followed by public humiliation and finally his expulsion from the house. He left with nothing but a suitcase and a resentment that would burn quietly for decades. That morning, however, he wasn't returning as the humiliated young man of the past. He was back as the new CEO of Andrade & Sons, after a calculated corporate maneuver that had left the rest of the family in shock. Quietly, Henrique had built his own empire abroad, buying smaller companies, investing in technology, and slowly acquiring Andrade & Sons shares through intermediaries. Once he gained a silent majority, he called a shareholders' meeting and, with cold, calculated votes, was elected the new chief executive. As he crossed the lobby, the sound of his footsteps echoed sharply. Some employees lowered their eyes, others couldn't look away. The security guard at the door, unsure whether to treat him as a visitor or a boss, simply stood still. Henrique didn't smile, didn't greet anyone. His pace was the perfect translation of someone who hadn't come to rebuild bridges, but to cut whatever remained of them. At the private elevator, he was greeted by Marta, the veteran secretary who had worked there since his grandfather's time. "Mr. Andrade," she began, hesitant. "This is quite a surprise." "I imagine it is," Henrique replied, his tone dry and almost neutral. "But get used to it. From now on, we'll be seeing a lot more of each other." The elevator climbed to the top floor where the boardroom was located. When the doors opened, 3 very familiar faces were already at the table. Paulo, his older brother and CFO, Clara, the middle sister and head of marketing, and Lucio himself, seated at the head of the table, hands clasped, his expression a mix of rage and disbelief. "Henrique," Lucio said with a falsely cordial tone, "I didn't expect you to take this game so far." "Yeah, Dad," Henrique replied, sitting down calmly. "I guess no one did." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Clara was the first to try breaking it. "If you're here to get revenge, you should know you won't find any cooperation." Henrique placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "I'm not here for cooperation. I'm here to make changes." Lucio's brow furrowed. "Changes? What kind of changes?" Henrique's gaze didn't waver. "The kind you least want to hear." The tension in the room tightened like a rope. Paulo, visibly irritated, muttered something about a corporate coup, but Henrique's only response was a barely noticeable smirk. He knew this was only the opening act. The real impact would come with his first official decision as CEO, a move that would not only change the course of the company but also shatter whatever remained of their family ties. And deep down, Henrique savored the moment. Years of humiliation, silence, and relentless work were about to converge into a single gesture, one that would echo forever through the halls of Andrade & Sons, and in the memory of every last one of them. Long before that triumphant morning return, the Andrade family's history was already lined with cracks invisible to anyone looking in from the outside. They were considered a picture of success, a tradition of business leadership, a constant presence at social events, glossy covers on business magazines. But behind the smiling photos and motivational speeches lay a cold core driven by self-interest and absolute control. The patriarch, Lucio Andrade, was a man who believed authority was imposed through strength and fear. He had built Andrade & Sons from the ground up, but also erected around himself an impenetrable wall. To him, children were moldable successors, and anyone who defied that mold was a threat to the empire. The eldest, Paolo, had inherited his father's rigid temperament. He had always been the perfect son in Lucio's eyes. Flawless grades, a businesslike posture from a young age, and no display of weakness. But Paolo also carried a trait Lucio both admired and feared: unbridled ambition. The CFO position fit him like a crown, but he wanted more, and until Henrique showed up, he believed he was on a clear path to the presidency. The middle child, Clara, possessed sharp social skills and a natural talent for shaping the family's public image. As head of marketing, she was responsible for keeping the Andrade name pristine, even when internal scandals threatened to spill over. For Clara, appearances were everything. Feelings were irrelevant. And then there was Henrique, the youngest. More introspective, less willing to fit into his father's mold. From an early age, he had shown talent with numbers and a modern vision for business, but his refusal to blindly follow Lucio's orders made him a problem. Things worsened after the death of Helena, their mother, the only person who had balanced the tension in the household. Without her, Lucio became even more unyielding, and arguments between father and son grew more heated. The breaking point came with the will. In life, Helena had left part of her shares to Henrique, believing it would secure her youngest a seat at the decision-making table. Fearing a division of control, Lucio called in lawyers and, exploiting loopholes and emotional pressure, tried to force Henrique to sell his stake for a fraction of its value. Henrique refused, and within months he was publicly accused by his own father of misconduct and dishonoring the family. The press, fed by stories planted by Clara, repeated the narrative: the rebellious son who shamed the legacy. Friends and allies distanced themselves. Henrique left the city with nothing but a suitcase, an unfinished degree, and a silent determination to return. Not to apologize, but to tip the scales. In the years that followed, while Paolo and Clara cemented their roles in the company and Lucio enjoyed the status of a magnate, Henrique built his reputation far from home. He worked for multinationals, invested in startups, took risks that nearly destroyed him but also taught him to play at the same level, and even above the Andrades. For more than 2 decades, he quietly tracked the family's every move, noting subtle financial declines, poor decisions, and small internal rifts. Patiently, he acquired Andrade & Sons shares through intermediaries, building silent power until, at the right moment, he would reveal his controlling stake. Now, seated at the boardroom table, staring into the faces that had once looked at him as an outsider, Henrique knew each expression held more than surprise. There was fear, because unlike them, he had nothing to lose emotionally. The bonds had been broken years ago, and what remained was purely a corporate game, one in which he held all the cards. And as Lucio fought to maintain a posture of command, Paolo clenched his jaw and Clara squeezed her pen. Henrique was already plotting his next move, not just to reverse the humiliation he had endured, but to dismantle, piece by piece, the throne they had always believed was unshakable. The past had shaped his exile. Now, he would shape their fall. Henrique's first week as CEO was a silent earthquake. No motivational speeches, no company-wide meetings with reassuring pats on the back. He took over as if stepping onto a battlefield. every move calculated to test the loyalty of those around him. On his very first day, he canceled every external consulting contract signed in the past 3 years. He knew most of them were nothing more than fronts to siphon money and maintain Paulo and Clara's personal alliances. That single move created immediate tension. Suppliers complained, internal allies whispered, and the siblings exchanged cutting looks over executive lunches. Enrique also made a point of visiting every department in person. He went down to the factory floor where production happened, spoke with workers who had never seen an Andrade up close, listened to their grievances, and took notes. Meanwhile, the directors debated whether this was just for show, or the prelude to something much bigger. At the same time, he began placing trusted people in strategic positions. 2 newly hired managers, both from companies he controlled, were planted in key areas, one in finance, the other in legal. Their mission was simple: gather information that could, at the right moment, expose every irregularity committed by Paulo, Clara, and, ideally, Lucio himself. Lucio, for his part, tried to maintain appearances. He still came to the company every day, but he no longer made decisions, at least not officially. He huddled with Paulo and Clara in hallways, away from Enrique, trying to craft a counterattack. They didn't yet know what his endgame was, but they were certain it was coming. The tension rose even higher when Enrique announced the launch of a full internal audit in every department. "It's to modernize processes and eliminate waste," he said in a neutral tone during a meeting. But everyone there knew what audit really meant. He was hunting for evidence. That very day, in the parking lot, Paulo lost his composure with Clara. "He's here to destroy us, Clara. Can't you see that?" "Of course I see it," she shot back, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "But if we lose our cool, he'll win faster. We need to find something on him." The problem was, there was nothing on Enrique. He had spent years off the radar, far from public scandal, building companies with spotless reputations and impeccable records. Unlike them, he carried no stains, at least none documented. While the trio scrambled to find a weakness, Enrique tightened the noose. He ordered the suspension of a multi-million-dollar contract with a raw material supplier, a company that conveniently belonged to Paulo's brother-in-law. The official reason? Cost-cutting and seeking more competitive suppliers. Slowly, allies of the old guard began to distance themselves, realizing that betting against Enrique would be corporate suicide. The whispers in the hallways shifted in tone. Now they spoke of the rejected son who came back stronger than anyone imagined. And while Lucio tried to hold back the tide and Paulo and Clara plotted against him, Enrique knew it still wasn't time to unveil his real plan. First, he needed to expose every flaw, every fraud, and every act of embezzlement committed by his own family. The final blow would be devastating, but for it to work, it would have to be surgical. Enrique knew that bringing down the Andrade Empire wasn't just about taking the company's presidency. It meant cutting out the roots, exposing every rot, and making it clear to everyone that the family was nothing more than a sandcastle built on lies. And that required more than impulsive actions. It demanded a meticulous, cold, and relentless plan. For weeks, he worked on an unusual schedule. He arrived before everyone else and left after the last employee had gone home. At night, the boardroom became a war room where, alongside 2 trusted advisors from his overseas companies, he combed through years of documents, contracts, and suspicious transactions. The internal audit, officially meant to modernize processes, turned out to be an arsenal of ammunition against Paulo and Clara. "Here," said one auditor, sliding a folder toward Enrique. "We found an overinflated contract signed by Paulo, with direct transfers to an offshore company." "And this?" asked another, holding up a printed email. "Clara pressuring the purchasing department to close a deal with a partner marketing agency that actually belongs to one of her college friends." Enrique didn't react emotionally. Every discovery was just another piece in the puzzle he was assembling. A detailed dossier with undeniable proof began to take shape, but he had no intention of simply handing it over to the authorities or the press. Not yet. The right moment would come, and when it did, the impact would be maximum. At the same time, he was gradually replacing the old guard's allies. Every director loyal to Lucio was quietly transferred, promoted to irrelevant positions, or dismissed with flawless justifications. In their place, Henrique installed trusted professionals, people who owed him their opportunities and would have no hesitation in backing his decisions. The plan also reached the company's foundation. He increased benefits for regular employees, implemented productivity bonuses, and launched training programs. The effect was immediate. While the family despised him, most workers began to see him as a fair and innovative leader. That meant when the final confrontation came, he would have the bulk of the company on his side. But the most strategic move was still ahead. Henrique reached out to major international investors and began negotiating a billion-dollar partnership to expand Andrade and Filios into markets the family had never dared to touch. The catch? The deal would contractually require every board member to undergo a rigorous compliance process, including a full asset investigation. He knew Paulo and Clara would never survive that unscathed. And Lucio? The patriarch carried decades' worth of fiscal maneuvers and shadowy contracts that, under scrutiny, would obliterate his reputation. At the end of one of these secret meetings, Henrique looked at his two advisors and said firmly, "Once this starts, there's no going back. They'll try to destroy me, but by the time they realize it, it'll be far too late." The plan was ready. All that remained was to pull the trigger. The Andrade and Filios boardroom was packed that morning. Directors, managers, lawyers, and shareholder representatives filled every seat, while journalists waited outside, ready to catch any sign of turmoil. The atmosphere was heavy, and everyone knew Henrique had called this extraordinary meeting to make a strategic announcement that would change the company's future. Paulo and Clara walked in together, trying to project confidence, but the tightness in their jaws betrayed their tension. Lucio arrived last, ignoring his youngest son and sitting at the opposite end of the table as if he were still the true commander. Henrique, immaculately dressed, carried himself like a predator ready to strike. He waited until everyone was seated before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past few months, I've been working to reposition Andrade and Filios in the international market. Today, I present to you the most important step in this new phase." He projected a document onto the screen bearing the logo of a prestigious foreign investment fund. "We've closed a global expansion deal worth $4 billion. This will put our company on a level you've never even imagined." The room filled with murmurs, but Henrique raised his hand for silence. He gaped. "However, there's one non-negotiable clause for this contract to be valid. All board members must undergo an international compliance process, including a full financial audit and complete asset investigation." The silence turned suffocating. Paulo and Clara exchanged pale looks. Lucio clenched his fist on the table. "This is absurd," the patriarch said in a low, grave tone. "You know very well this is an invasion of privacy." "It's not an invasion, Father," Henrique replied coolly. "It's a market requirement. Either we go through with it or the deal doesn't happen." Paulo tried to step in. "Henrique, there are other ways to expand. We don't have to subject ourselves to this." "Oh, but we do," Henrique cut him off, locking eyes with him. "After all, everyone here claims to have nothing to hide, right?" The discomfort was palpable. Some directors were already whispering among themselves. Henrique pressed on. "The internal audit has already uncovered certain irregularities. But for now, I've treated them merely as points of attention. Starting today, everything will be in the hands of external, independent, international auditors." At that moment, he pulled 3 sealed envelopes from a folder and placed them on the table in front of Paulo, Clara, and Lucio. "These are preliminary reports on suspicious transactions involving each of you. just a sample of what the auditors will be looking into. Clara opened hers and froze at the sight of copies of emails, bank transfers, and fraudulent contracts tied to her name. Paolo's file revealed shell companies in tax havens. Lucio's contained records of secret accounts and undeclared multi-million-dollar transactions, turning his face so red he looked ready to explode. "This is a setup," the patriarch roared, slamming his hand on the table. "No," Enrique said calmly. "This is justice." Then came the sentence everyone would remember. "In as my first official decision as CEO, I'm suspending all Andrade family members, except myself, from their duties, effective immediately until the audit is complete." The shock was instantaneous. Paolo stood, pointing a finger at his brother. "You're destroying the family." Enrique smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Paolo. I'm just giving you exactly what you gave me 20 years ago." Outside, journalists saw the boardroom doors open and caught the images. Paolo and Clara leaving the building in a rush, while Lucio, furious, refused to speak to the press. Enrique remained inside, greeting investors and giving interviews as if he had just achieved exactly what he'd always wanted. The blow had been dealt, and the damage was irreversible. The days following the confrontation were a public spectacle. The press milked every detail of the Andrade downfall, with headlines splashed across newspapers. "Scandal at Andrade and Filios. CEO ousts family from leadership. $1 million frauds come to light." Enrique, on the other hand, maintained a carefully professional stance, avoiding direct attacks but letting the evidence speak for itself. Inside the company, the atmosphere had shifted. Employees who once feared retaliation began to speak up. Internal complaints surfaced, each reinforcing the irregularities committed by Paolo, Clara, and even Lucio. The external audit moved quickly, and each day brought new revelations that made any attempt by the family to reclaim power impossible. But Enrique knew the final piece was still missing, something that would not only confirm their fall, but seal the family's fate forever. That piece appeared when one of the auditors handed him a folder unlike the others. "We found this in the old files from the legal department," the man said, his expression serious. Inside was a document Enrique never expected to see, a copy of his mother Helena's original will. The document, altered decades earlier by Lucio to reduce his inheritance, clearly showed she had left Enrique not just a portion of the shares but majority control of the company. More than that, there was a handwritten letter from Helena to him, dated just months before her death. "Enrique, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. I want you to know I always believed in you. The company needs someone who will lead it with justice, and I know you will be that person. Protect what is ours, but don't lose yourself in the thirst for revenge." Her words stirred something in him that had been dormant. For the first time, Enrique hesitated, not about what needed to be done, which was already decided, but about how he would do it. The revenge he had so carefully orchestrated now carried a different weight. Still, the will's revelation couldn't be ignored. Enrique decided to make it public, not as an act of hatred, but as a historical correction. He called a press conference and, before cameras and microphones, revealed the original document and his mother's letter. "For years, I was made to believe I had no place in this family, that I was unworthy of being part of the company my mother helped build. Today, the truth comes to light, and with it, the certainty that Andrade and Filios must return to its roots of integrity and vision." The news hit like a bomb. Lucio was summoned to answer for manipulating the will, and lawyers were already discussing possible criminal charges. Paolo and Clara, finding themselves cornered, began negotiating settlements to avoid harsher prosecutions. But the real turning point lay in the deal with the International Fund. The compliance clause uncovered such a vast number of irregularities that the contract automatically called for the removal of any executive involved in fraud. The result? Paolo, Clara, and Lucio were permanently banned from the board, with no possibility of return. Enrique now held absolute control of Andrade and Filios, but the victory was bittersweet. He had accomplished his goal, yet Helena's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't just about tearing down. It was about rebuilding something of true worth. The family empire was gone, and at the center of its ruins, Henrique stood, not as the rejected son, but as the only Andrade left standing. Months had passed since the day Henrique delivered the final blow against his own family. Andrade and Sons, once a fiefdom marked by internal disputes and veiled corruption, was entering a new era. The hallways, once heavy with tension, now breathed an air of renewal. New projects were flourishing. Employees were receiving training and opportunities that had once been the privilege of a select few, and the company was expanding its operations with a clear focus: transparency and efficiency. Henrique, however, did not celebrate with fanfare. His office, now far simpler than his father's pompous one, reflected his new philosophy: less ostentation, more results. He spent hours reviewing reports, attending meetings with teams from all levels, and staying in direct contact with investors. To many, he was the leader the company had always needed. As for the family, their fates were sealed. Paulo, without the prestige and network that fueled his side businesses, found himself on the margins of the market. He tried starting a new company, but the stigma of his frauds drove investors away. Clara, on the other hand, moved abroad, claiming to be starting over, but in reality, fleeing the legal consequences still looming over her. Lucio, the patriarch, faced a lawsuit that permanently tarnished his legacy. From an influential, respected man, he had become a symbol of arrogance and corruption. Even in the face of this crushing victory, Henrique felt a silent weight in his chest. On some nights, he stayed alone in the office, reading and rereading Helena's letter. Her words, simple and direct, echoed as a constant reminder that power without purpose was empty. He had won, yes, but he knew that if he let resentment guide him from then on, he would be doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. That's why, at the company's annual meeting, standing before all the employees, he gave a speech that many would remember forever. For a long time, I was told I didn't belong here. Today, I'm not here to prove them wrong, but to show that we can be better. Our recent history has been marked by secrets, betrayals, and abuse of power. That ends now. Andrade and Sons will be remembered not for what it lost, but for what it chose to become. The words were met with sincere applause. Not flattery, but respect. Deep down, Henrique knew that his greatest triumph was not just bringing down those who had rejected him, but building something new from the ruins. He didn't want to be remembered only as the rejected son who came back as CEO and destroyed his own family. He wanted to be remembered as the man who took a stained inheritance and turned it into a worthy legacy. And so, as the city lights shone outside and night fell over the Andrade and Sons building, Henrique closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and, for the first time in decades, felt he was exactly where he was meant to be.